Well, hey there, everybody. It's Dr. Austin Perlmutter. I've been thinking a lot about anxiety, and I've been thinking about this not just because it's an interesting thing to study, but because it's something that I experience. And I think that right now it's something that a lot of us are experiencing. It obviously makes sense. Anxiety is tethered to uncertainty, and with the state of the world right now, the last couple of months, there's just a lot more uncertainty. So I'm seeing this both in myself and in the conversations I have with other people. No one's really all that sure of what to do next or what to expect. We don't know how to predict how we will get through this. We don't know what getting through this means. Are we going back to the way things were? Is that even possible? And so it's brought up a lot in both me and looking at the data, looking at Americans, for example, where about half of them say they're having significant anxiety around COVID, specifically the disease itself, and then everyone that's experiencing the economic, social consequences of this. It's a really big deal. And I don't have to get into the specifics of why anxiety is such a problem. It significantly limits our quality of life in addition to having a lot of overlap with other mental health and physical conditions. So I want to talk today a little bit about the kind of neuroscience of anxiety, but also about maybe more of the psychological, even philosophical ideas of what we can be doing on a day-to-day basis to help dampen down this anxiety mechanism and the experience of it. And again, this is also coming from my own experience with this, because I think that, in general, people who go into the medical training world are those who are willing to tolerate higher levels of stress, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we, and I know for me, weren't also experiencing anxiety in that training, as well as just in general these types of jobs that require a lot of difficult decisions. So let's start with the basics of anxiety. What is anxiety? It's, in essence, a pathological concern for the future. It's getting stuck in this cycle where we are worried about what's going to happen in the future, for the most part, without really being productive about it. So we're just concerned about it. We're playing it over in our brains without making good plans. It's this really interesting thing that humans have, which is the ability to plan for the future. But it comes with this major consequence, which is that we become so fixated on the possibility that things will go poorly for us, that we're really unable to benefit from this future-oriented perspective. Now, I do want to say, anxiety, like many things, is a spectrum. And so at a very low level, that sympathetic kind of stress activation that can become later on a really bad anxiety is helpful in enabling us to be motivated and enabling us to really focus on getting something done. But when that stress mechanism is activated for longer periods of times at higher levels, it changes our thought process so that we become pathologically concerned for the future. And anxiety has a lot of different flavors. Generalized anxiety is kind of the one that we talk about most, but you can have social anxiety, PTSD, a phobia. Again, these are all states in which we are becoming increasingly and unnecessarily concerned about events that really sometimes are not a big deal. I mean, kind of by definition, we are blowing things out of proportion. So what's going on in the brain with anxiety? Well, one of the things that has been clear is that it's closely tied with the stress and HPA axis, so hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and it's also been closely tied to overactivation of the amygdala. It's thought that there is decreased activity in the prefrontal cortex in kind of calming down the amygdala, and when that amygdala goes unchecked, we become unnecessarily worried and stressed, and that then contributes to a lot of these anxiety conditions. So, given that this is such a big problem, that is something that so many of us are experiencing, I want to talk through some of my personal strategies for mitigating anxiety, and hopefully those will be a benefit to you, but I'd love to hear yours as well. So, first off, I like to think about what are the things that we can do to kind of lower on the front end, preventive strategies for anxiety. And when it comes to stress, I think there's a lot of things we can do to lower our exposure to stress, and some of those might be good, so it's not putting ourselves in stressful situations. But with anxiety, it's not really a question of the total amount of stress. It's a question of how we perceive things. So to this end, I think that we need to think about strategies that set our brains up to perceive things in a more positive way, in a less anxiety-provoking way. And to that end, one of the things that we can do is really work through that stress pathway. So you can see here I'm outside. Nature is a wonderful, cheap, really free intervention that we can be using to lower stress in our lives, to lower our reactivity and stress. So I cite this study a lot, but there's a study out of Ann Arbor from University of Michigan that showed 20 minutes of urban nature exposure is enough to lower the levels of salivary stress hormone cortisol significantly. So just getting outside for 20 minutes once a week is probably enough to do you a lot of good, but I really recommend, as much as possible, getting a little bit of nature exposure each day. Then the other two things that are worth thinking about here are sleep and mindfulness or meditation. That's because both of those help to kind of integrate the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala and decrease our emotional reactivity, which is a key component to anxiety. All right, so now let's talk about some psychological interventions that are helpful with anxiety. In general, there are kind of these three things that people talk about when it comes to this. There is suppression, which is, I feel anxious, let me try to calm that down by just suppressing those feelings. There is the acceptance, which is to say, I am feeling anxious, but I'm just going to kind of go with this and experience it for what it is. And then there's reappraisal. And reappraisal is an interesting one because it might mean reframing your anxiety as something like excitement. And it might also mean, changing the way that you look at anxiety to make it a positive. So for example, you're driving to an important meeting at your office, you get stuck in traffic. Instead of dwelling on how terrible it is that you're going to be late for your meeting, you say, well, look at this opportunity that I have to, practice mindfulness, but also maybe to see some of the birds that are on that trip, or to see, to have a moment to listen to some more music. And as it relates to one of my favorite techniques within the psychological treatments, which is CBT, the reappraisal is really the most standard as far as the techniques to use. And if you look at some of the CBT-based websites and protocols, reappraisal seems to be one of the best studied of the mechanisms as far as these three that I've talked about, but there is also evidence for the acceptance-based therapy as well. I do want to mention as well, kind of talking about nutritional and other interventions that we can make to help quell anxiety. And I've talked at length in other videos about the connection between the HPA axis, the microbiome, and really the gut health, and how that then affects our brains. And so there's this intense bidirectional relationship between the gut, the microbiome, I should say more so, and the HPA axis, where the production of cortisol seems to damage the gut lining, which causes increased inflammation by permeability, and where the microbiome seems to actually influence early on in life for sure, but also later on in life, our HPA axis reactivity and tone. So to that end, I think it's really important to both look at interventions to lower inflammation in our diet, as well as using interventions to support gut health. And I've gone through these in many videos, but in general, if you're looking for the biggest bang for your buck, stop eating and drinking sugar, so anything with added sugar and refined carbohydrates as an intervention to lower inflammation, and eat fiber as an intervention to improve your gut health. The last thing I want to bring up here is this whole conversation of anxiety really brings to mind the idea of control, and where is it that we have control in our lives? And I think that there is this prevailing mentality that we have a lot more control than we actually do. And so we cling to this control. We cling to this idea that we are responsible for, in charge of all these aspects of our lives, when in reality we have very little control over much of what happens. And so anxiety is clinging to a sense that we can modify the future far more than we can. And I think that just as a kind of a philosophical idea, the question of what is control and how much do we actually have in our day-to-day can be very liberating when we think about this, because it helps us to perhaps break some of these cycles of stuckness, one of which is anxiety, getting stuck in the future. And anyway, that's what I've got for you today. So bottom line, I think a lot of us are experiencing anxiety right now. I know that I am a bit around coronavirus, sure, but also, just the uncertainty that comes from it. This is the state of things, and so it's up to us to come up with strategies to mitigate that anxiety. And to that end, I think that we can be using both the general brain-based strategies as well as the psychological strategies, and maybe just a little bit of philosophy as it relates to questioning what exactly do we have control over. So hope this was good for you. I would love to hear your thoughts, and I hope you have a phenomenal and low anxiety day.